everyone, this is Dr. Jenny Norton with Missourians for Safe Public Schools. The purpose of this video is to give a legislative update, but I also want to talk a little bit about charter schools and how they operate and the reason why these bills that are being presented are so problematic. So I made a post earlier today. There's several pieces of legislation, a couple in the Senate, a couple in the House, that are basically a bundle for vouchers that will do a couple different things. One, it's about expanding virtual education. Two, it's about providing a budget for school choice. So what that would do is it would siphon off public education dollars for private and charter school and what they're calling school choice, which is terrible rhetoric because there's actually no choice in school choice. And then also expanding, parents' right to choose. So I want to talk a little bit about how charter schools work so we can talk about why this is problematic. So there's public charter schools and there's private charter schools. Public charter schools are generally where a public school is turned into a public charter school. So I'm from Arkansas, which has really kind of dictated the landscape in school choice, because when I worked at the University of Arkansas, they have a Department of Education Reform that the Walton Family Foundation has. You can go apply, you can look at their website, you can get millions of dollars if you want to open charter schools. And then they kind of well fund this department that kind of promotes this agenda of school reform using the idea of school choice or the privatization of education. So when we do this with public schools, what happens is, so for example, we had issues with rural school districts where one rural school district applied to be a public charter school system. And other local school districts then could apply, folks in other school districts could apply to attend in this school district. What would happen is there's no busing services, there's no after school services. So the only students who really had the opportunity to choose to go to the school are students who have parents with resources who can drive them to school, pick them up from school, and provide all these things. So this is about access and entitlements as part of it. In a private charter school, this can be done in a lot of different ways, but what this is where there's a private entity, and we can go into the research behind this. There's lots of corporations that kind of back this type of thing where we privatize education. This is not too dissimilar to how we have privatized the military, how we have privatized prisons, and how we have privatized healthcare. What happens when we privatize it and then is we get to choose who gets it and who gets access to it and what quality of the education that they get. What you need to know about charter schools is they receive waivers where they do not have to meet the same requirements that public schools have to meet. So this means sometimes that they do not have to provide standardized testing in the way that teachers have to, public schools have to. They do not have to hire highly qualified teachers. Oftentimes charter schools will use Teach for America. They train folks who have degrees in other areas in 5 weeks how to be a teacher. I just want to point out that if a child receives poor education or a teacher who is not effective 2 years in a row, it has long-term consequences on their overall success. So Teach for America only requires these newly educated folks who are not trained to be teachers 2 years. And so generally you're not good at teaching until your third year. So it's this revolving door of folks who aren't actually invested in education in the way that traditionally trained folks typically are. And then they don't have to pay them the way that they would normally have to pay other teachers. So it's kind of a loophole for them to be able to pocket money for privatizing education. A couple things you need to know with these vouchers too is typically when they do funding like this, and this is like template legislation that they use in many other states. This is happening in Kansas, it's happening in Iowa, it's happening in Arkansas, but they don't pay for the full amount of tuition. So for example, under this current piece of legislation, families would get around $6,700, but a private school tuition is generally a minimum of $15,000 if you don't apply for a scholarship, which means that only people who have the money to pay the difference will have access to go. So you see how this rhetoric of school choice is not really choice. It's about if you already had access to this choice, about you getting benefits on top of already having access to those resources. So those who already are in disenfranchised situations, I'm thinking particularly our rural schools and our urban schools. The rural schools already, infrastructure is falling apart, teachers are not paid well, students don't have access to the same types of education as more suburban areas typically get, and they're going to be decimated. Then you have the urban areas, and you're going to see, we already have this with white flight and with more segregation in schools than we already have. But So that's coming from that. Charter schools and private schools don't have to accept everyone. There's a lot of pieces of legislation, and you can see some research that I've posted on Twitter today. They don't have to offer special education services. They don't have to offer services for students that speak English as a second language. They don't have to offer psychological services. They don't have to offer speech pathology services. There's so many different things that your children don't get that public schools are required to offer that charter and private schools are not. And then you see how we take money away from that. Public schools are not able to offer that with the same quality. And then private schools and charter schools don't have to offer it at all. There is even an instance, I went on a state tour in Arkansas where we went to a couple different charter schools and we went to Forest City. There was only one trained educator in the entire building. And she did so much labor for the other people who had been hired as educators, many of them through Teach for America. They were underprepared, no surprise, 5 weeks to prepare you for teaching. And she left at the end of her first year because she was so burnt out from providing support for all of these people and not being supported by administration. So after that year, there were 0 highly qualified teachers in that school. I just don't understand. And this is an anecdotal experience that fits in with the larger narrative and the research with this that just doesn't support student success and student achievement. Charter schools are notorious for kicking out hard to teach students. So they also make they tend to either market themselves towards higher end students. So for example, you have like Haas Hall Academy, which tries to make it seem more elite and kind of markets itself to more wealthy, higher socioeconomic status, typically white families. And then you have places like KIPP schools who tend to target poor, also more Black and brown schools, and they tend to do more character education, that it's more assimilation and like kind of problematic. What else? Charter schools, there is 0 research that supports that they outperform public schools. 0. There is 0 research that supports this. They actually increase segregation, which I already kind of hit on. I have a list of things here. I'm trying to think what else. And in the long term, we end up with empty buildings. Long-term success, it's terrible. So we end up taking away money from public education for this thing that isn't long-term. And so I think that's the part that's going to be really dangerous about if these bills pass. This is why I think it's really important for not just educators, but for administrators, for parents, for community members to all stand up and say that this is not where we want our tax dollars to go, because what will happen is they will end up having to increase the amount of money we get to public education. These charter schools will not be successful. It will create a revolving door of educators that will hurt the populations of students that it serves. And then it will not be sustainable over time. And we will be back in the situation of needing to rely on public education. And I just do not want to be put in a position to have to reframe all the time, which is already a position that we're put in for public education. So it's really important, I think, for all of us in Missouri that this legislation does not pass, because we need fully funded public education. That is the best way to provide access to education for all students in rural areas, for students who speak English as a second language, for students who need special education services, for students who live in inner cities. Those students need access to quality classes and quality teachers. And the more that we create these choices, the more that those who have privilege and access to resources get to have access to those resources, and the less access that those who already didn't have resources. So it just stratifies that difference even more. And so things that you could be mentioning on Twitter are about how this will decimate urban and rural schools. There is 0 accountability for this. I made a tweet that's like letting someone who's drunk driving be in charge of what's going on. If there's 0 accountability, then this is about making money off of educating students. And in a place where teachers are already struggling to make more than those who like to make living wages, it's just not an effective long-term policy for us. So I just really encourage you to contact them. They did meet today. I saw some really wild things. Justin Hill, representative in District 108, watch out for him. He is very pro school choice, and he has a lot of confidence, and he has, no expertise on the situation. So really question what you're hearing from the committee. And I would encourage you to get your voice in the mix. So use the hashtag MOLEG and just kind of go in there. I could use some retweets or some likes, or if you feel comfortable enough to kind of put your voice out there, I'd really appreciate it. Several people have always done so. So solidarity, friends, but keep paying attention. I know that we're all tired, but the fight for public education is real, and there's just no downtime. So I hope that this sparks some motivation and some passion and possibly some conversation, but I want to make sure that we understand how charter schools operate and why that is fundamentally inappropriate and bad for our children and bad for public education. So I wish everybody a great week, and hopefully I'll see you on Twitter. Bye.